Welcome to the EC114 Stata Labs at the Department of Economics of Essex University. In these labs you will learn how to use Stata, which is a software for data analysis. Today we'll do a brief overview of the software and some of its functionalities that you will learn during these 5 labs. So to start with, this is how Stata looks like in a Macintosh. I know most of you will probably be using Stata in a Windows computer. Just to show you how it looks like in Windows, it's pretty much the same structure. Basically, it has 3 main areas that you will look at. This is the main output window, so whatever you write and you feed into Stata, the results, you will get them over here. This is the window that will show you the variables that you have in your dataset, the dataset you're currently using. Over here you have some properties of the variables that you're using. You can click on the variable and see some of its properties, what type of variable you have, the name, the size of the variable, etc. On the left here you have a window that displays the latest commands that you have run, so it keeps track of the work you're doing. And down here you have the command window. This is the window where you can insert commands that Stata will produce into an output. We won't be using the command window because the goal here is that you write scripts that can be saved and use at a later stage, or that you can send someone to share the work you're doing. Writing the commands directly in the command window prevents you from doing that, which means you end up losing the work you do over the time you're working with the software. So this is how Stata looks like. We'll start by opening what we call a do file editor. And this is basically a text editor where you write all your code. You write all the commands with notes attached to them, so you know what, and you keep track of what you're doing. And then we save this do file editor, and from this editor we're able to send all the commands directly into Stata. So in Windows, in this little box over here with the pencil, this is where you start. You open a new do file editor, and from here you can basically open new data sets, import data into Stata, and do everything that you need to. So we'll go back into Stata. So if I click here on a Mac, it's a little bit bigger. If I click on the new do file editor, so I basically have a text editor where I can write everything I want in it. So we will start by looking at some of the basic commands in Stata. First of all, when we write do files, it's important that we give them a particular structure so that we keep track of the work we're doing, especially because these do files can get very long and very complicated. So when you go back and you look at them, you want to see exactly what you've done. So it's important that at the beginning of each do file we write a little introduction of what the do file does. We write the author of the do file, the date it was written, so you keep again track of your work. And we can simply do that by typing in this. So /* followed by */ whatever we write between these two symbols, Stata considers it as a comment, not as a command to be run or to give a specific output. So here I can simply type in introduction to Stata, and I know that this do file will give a basic introduction to the Stata functionalities. Now, Stata is a language like any other, and as a language you need practice. So it's important that whenever you watch these videos, it's important that you practice writing this code. As you get used to it, the commands will just pop in your head, and you'll know instinctively how to write the code. but for that you really need to practice these commands over and over again until you essentially memorize them and understand the structure and how the syntax of the software works. Once you understand that, it's much easier for you to implement new commands and understand how new commands work as well, especially when we get to stuff that is a little bit more complicated. So today we'll just look at some basic stuff. I've already written a do file for this video, which I will make available at a later stage. So in the next video I will give you the links to the do files of this video. In the meantime, you can just copy the contents onto your own do file. So I'm gonna open my do file, and I will walk you through the structure of the do file. So as you can see, first thing that I have written on my do file is the version of the software in which I am working on, followed by a command that I'll talk a little bit more as we go along. Set more off. The way you run these commands onto the main Stata window is by pressing Command Shift D. In Windows, you will do that by simply selecting the line you want to run and pressing Control D. Now it's important you select either the line or just partially the line that you want to run, because if you don't select anything and you simply press Control D, Stata will run the whole do file, and sometimes that's not what you want to do. You just simply want to run a specific command. So if I press Command Shift D, again, if you're in Windows you would press Control D. If I press this, the command is sent over to the main Stata window and I get a result. So set more off was successfully implemented, which basically means that whenever the output window gets full with results, it updates automatically and gives me everything at once rather than having to wait for the results to update. But we'll see how that works in a minute. Now I've written a little bit of an introduction here on what this do file does. So it's important that you write the file name you're working on, the date, the author of the file, what is the purpose of writing this do file, what input files are you going to work with, and what output files are you creating. So we're going to use two data sets today. The first data set is a world data which includes variables on 191 countries. These variables are based on data that was compiled by Pippa Norris and is made available at her website, or alternatively you can download it from this link over here. So all that you need is to copy this link and you'll be able to download this data set that we'll be using today. The second data set is a data set from the British Household Panel Survey, and is just a very small subset with some interesting variables for us to look at. And again, this data set is actually available from this link in an Excel file, so it's an Excel format. This data set is actually available in Stata format, so this is the extension of Stata data files. We will learn how to import files that are actually in different formats, such as Excel, comma separated values, tab delimited files, and Excel files directly. So first thing we will do with Stata is to open a log file. The purpose of the log file is to store everything that we do on this session. So everything that appears in the output window, all the outputs that we're going to receive, we will store them in a text file, so that we can, after we close our session, we can go back and look at all the results that we got and run some thorough analysis on that, rather than having to copy all the tables that we get on the output window and pasting them somewhere else. So we can do that. First thing, we will use a command which is capture log close. This command essentially closes any log file that is already open that we may have left open from a previous session. So we can simply run this command, and then we start using a log file. So the structure of the syntax is very simple. This is the log command, and it works this way. Log, using between quotation marks, we type in the name of the log file that we want to give. In this case, I just typed lab1 underscore log.txt. You can type whatever you want. Then there's a comma, and after the comma we always give a couple of options that we may need. We're using the option replace. This option simply replaces whatever text we may have in this log file with the new output that we're going to create, and this tells Stata that we want to create a text log file. So we can run this command, again command shift D, and this is sent over to Stata, and we get our first output. So this file was not found because it hadn't been previously created, but here we have the type of the log, which is a text file, and opened on this date. So going back to our do file, now the first thing we want to do with Stata, which is a very important part of starting to work on the software, is to set up the working directory or the working environment. Now this is essentially telling Stata that we're going to work from a particular folder, so that Stata knows where to store our files, where to retrieve files from, etc. So this is done using the change directory command. Now this command takes one argument, which is essentially the path to the folder that we're going to work from, and the path is always given between quotation marks. Now for us to know the path, we actually need to go back to the folder. So I have all my files in this folder. So I have here the dataset we're going to work with, BHPS dataset and the world data. And for me to know what is the path of this folder on a Macintosh, I can simply do right click, click on get info, and copy the path here where it says where. So if I copy all this and I go back to my Stata do file and I paste, now this will tell Stata that I'm going to retrieve my files from the folder EC114 Stata Labs that is stored in this path. So if I run this, now Stata has successfully changed the working directory to this, which I can also see here on the bottom. If you are working on a Windows machine, there are a couple of ways you can retrieve the working directory. So the first way is simply, here I'm trying to find the working directory in which the BHPS small dataset is stored. So I can simply do a right click and then click on properties, and if I click on properties, I get a small window and I get the location of the file. So this is exactly the same thing. So I just need to copy the location of the file and paste the location of the file onto my do file over here. So I just need to copy it over here between the quotation marks. Another way you can retrieve the location is simply by clicking on this bar over here, and once you click on it, just a left click, you essentially get the location. So you can also copy it directly from here. So these are two very simple ways you can get the location of the files in Windows. So going back to my Stata do file, so I can simply run this. So I've set the working directory. Stata now knows where I'm working from, and now I can essentially open any file directly from the do file. So let's first look at some of the basic commands in Stata that will allow us to interact a little bit more with the data we're going to work with. So if I go back to the folder and open the world data directly, so I can just double click and open it. If you're working at the university on campus, it's very likely that when you try to double click directly on the data set, Stata or the computer does not know what type of a file is this, because it just isn't simply able to relate this to Stata. So most of the times you'll have to open the file through the Stata drop-down menus. So you can come to File, Open, and you can essentially go to the folder, Dropbox, Public, EC114 Stata Labs, Stata Lab 1, and I have here the data file. So I can essentially open the world data. Now, we can for now hide the command window over here that gives me the last commands that I have given, and I can expand the variable window so I can look at all the variables that I have in my data set. Essentially, I can look at these variables and the values they have stored in by clicking on the data browser. In Windows, again, these two are going to be a little bit smaller, and they're going to be over here. So this is the data browser, and this is the data editor, same that we have here, the data browser and the data editor. So if I click on that, now I can see all the variables that I have. So each variable is a column in this data matrix. You're gonna see differences in the colors that we have. So Stata is able to store information in different ways. It's able to store numerical values, such as these ones. So all the black numbers you see here. So these are this variable is a numerical variable. So this is a value that Stata understands as a value. This variable is what we call a string variable. This is a variable that Stata does not interpret as numeric. So it's simply a name that can contain both numbers and letters. In this case, this is the name of the countries that we have in our data set. And there is very little you can do with these variables, and usually we have to recode these variables into numerical figures so that Stata can use them for other purposes. So these will usually appear in red, and you know that whenever you see a red variable over here, you have essentially a string variable that you cannot, for example, perform any calculations with. Then you have these blue values over here, and these blue values are essentially labels that we're able to put on top of the numbers. So let's say that our numbers, let's say that we have a categorical variable, a nominal variable, for example, and that we have numbers, and we want to know what the numbers actually mean. We can essentially put a label on top of these numbers, and the label will appear in blue, but behind the label the number is still stored, and Stata is still able to compute a lot of different operations on the variable because it's numerical. So if you ask Stata to give you the median value, for example, Stata is able to do that because it has a number attached to it, but on top we have put a label so that we understand what the values mean. So these are the three types of variables that we find. So in blue it's a labeled variable that is numerical, in black is essentially a numerical variable with no label, and in red we have a string variable, which is just a text variable that can have both letters and numbers. So we can look at the whole data matrix. We can select only some of the variables that we want to look at. For example, if our data set is too big, like this one, and we may just be interested in looking at some of the variables like GDP per capita, for example, you can just click on that and click on the variable country and compare directly and eyeball the data. So this is a good functionality that Stata has that it didn't have in the past. and at the same time we're able to look at some of the properties for the variable. So for example, this variable is a string variable, so the str stands for string, and the number that comes after the str denotes the number of characters, the maximum number of characters that we have in the variable, which in this case is 24, which is led by a particular observation, probably this one, that has 24 characters. So if you count all of the characters, including spaces, in this observation of the variable country, you'll probably get to 24, which is the type of variable that we have here. So in the browser we can simply look at the data. If we click here on edit, you may get a warning message saying or asking you whether you really want to switch to edit. We can actually make changes here. We can create new variables by introducing numbers, and we can make changes directly onto the data matrix, which is something that you may not want to do directly here. You may want to create a line of code that makes that change for you, so that in the future you know what change was made and why, and you can attach particular notes to that. So as you can see, there are several ways we can write comments. So all the stuff that you see in green, this stuff is not a static command. This is just a comment to what we're making here. So if I run this, nothing really happens, but this is a nice way of adding comments to the stuff that we are doing. So we've opened the log file, we have set the working directory. So now let's look at some of the basic commands. So the command describe, if you select describe and press Command Shift D, describe essentially will give us a brief overview of our data set. It lists all the variables, the type of variable that we have, and there are different types, but whenever we see str, we know the variable is string. The other types are numerical. The value label for each of the variable, and the variable label. So the variable label is a nice feature that we have, which allows us to, with some restrictions, give an explanation of what the variable is. So here dem_other is the percentage of other democracies in the region. So this allows us to give an explanation of what the variables are. So with the describe command, we can essentially look at all the variables, labels, some of the variables that we may have to recode because they are string variables, look at whether all the others are numerical or not, what type of numerical variable we have, whether we have labels for the numbers in these variables, etc. Then we have the summarize command, which is the first command to give us descriptive statistics. So if we run summarize, this will give us a summary of all the variables. So it gives us the number of observations for each variable, the mean, the standard deviation, the minimum, and the maximum value. This is a good way of eyeballing and seeing whether we have a lot of missing information for some of the variables or not. And it's clear here that some of the variables we really do have some missing cases that may be problematic for our analysis in the future. Both of these commands can be used with shortcuts. So describe can simply be used with a D, and summarize can simply be used with a shortcut sum. Okay. Browse allows us to open the browser directly, so we don't have to click, we can simply type it. Now all of these commands, there is a help file associated to them which allows you to look at the syntax and how the command works. So if we click here help describe, This opens the help file for the command describe. This explains the syntax of the command, what the command does, and gives us all the options that come after the comma. So every time there is a comma after a command, it means we want to add extra options to it. And here we have all the options that we can use with the describe command. You have a lengthy description of what it does, of what each of the options do, and in the end you usually have examples of how to use this command. Now the help files are incredibly useful once you understand the syntax of these commands and you're able to interpret what this actually means. So as you come across a lot of these commands, the help files do become easier to interpret and to understand, and you'll be able to implement them. And have a look always at the examples that you're given, because they're a good starting point to start using these commands. So you will find many commands on the internet, which is a great source of information for how to perform different tasks in Stata, and you can use the help file then to understand the commands that you're learning along the way. Another important command on data management is the sort command. This allows you to sort the information on particular variables. So let's say that we want to sort the data set on country and colony, for example. So we can simply type in sort on country, and you can actually open the data browser as we do it so that you can see the information changing. So we can sort on country and colony, and if we run it, you should see that actually nothing changed because it was already sorted on both of these, but we can choose, for example, type of religion, so sort on type rel, which is here, and if we run on this, we can actually see the data set changed. And if we scroll over to type of relationship, we can actually see that the information is sorted, and we have first all Roman Catholics observations, then all the Protestants, Orthodox, Jewish, Muslim, etc. This is an important command because a lot of the operations that we want to do when we want to do in a particular order, or to eyeball the data, is also important. Then we have the list command. The list allows us to take a look at all the values that a variable assumes. So we can just list country, for example, and we can see number of observation and what is the value. In this case, what is the name of the country that we have. So when you have a large number of observations, these lists can be a lot difficult to read. So so we usually prefer to use them with particular restrictions, which we'll see in a little bit, which are called the if and in commands. So now let's look at importing data. So in this case, we had this data set in a DTA extension file, which is a Stata file, but that is not always the case. Many times we have data sets that come in Excel format, or in CSV, or TXT, or in very different formats that we will need to transform into something that Stata can read. So thankfully, Stata can read a lot of different formats, a lot of different files, and the two commands that will help us bring the information into Stata from different files is the insheet and the import command. So we can look at just the basic structure of these commands. So InSheet can read data created by a spreadsheet. This is the basic syntax. InSheet var list using file name with some options available to us. Now we are going to use the InSheet command to bring a comma separated values file and a tab delimited text file, and we will bring all the variables in the dataset, so we don't have to specify which variables we're interested in bringing. So the syntax will simply be InSheet using the file name and then some options. Well, we may tell Stata that we're bringing a tab delimited on the one hand and a comma separated value file on the other hand, and we may tell Stata to clear whatever data is in memory. So now we have this dataset open. We cannot open a new dataset without getting rid of this one. So we may just tell Stata to get rid of whatever dataset we have in memory, and we will also use this option names, which basically tells Stata that the variable names are included on the first line of the file, and you will understand why. So first, the code is already written here. Well, let's look at the file that we're going to use. So we're going to bring this British Household Panel Survey file. So this file has information on the number of the respondent for this particular survey, on the gender, age. This variable is the hours worked per week. This variable gives us the basic rate of payment per hour, and here we have the education level. So clearly the name of the variables are stored on the first row here of our data matrix. So we'll need to tell Stata how to handle this information and not to consider this a value of a variable but the name of the variable itself. So first thing we're going to do, just for illustration purposes, is to save this data file as a comma separated value file. Okay, and by saving it like this, we will see how we can import this into Stata. So we will save it using the same name, bhps small. This will tell us that we have multiple sheets, but we want to save the active sheet, and we'll do continue, and we'll close, and again it asks us to save what we already saved. So we'll go back to Stata and we'll try to open the first file. So every time you bring a file or open a file in Stata, make sure you introduce the name of the file between quotation marks. This is because sometimes there is a space in the name of the file that you are not aware of, and if there, for example, if there was a space here, if this was the name of the file bhps space small, and I had forgotten to use the quotation marks, Stata would take bhps as the name of the file and would disregard small, and it would crash here. So we can actually try this to see how what happens when we insert a command that Stata is not able to process. And well, essentially it cleared the information we had in memory, but it told us that the name small.csv is invalid. So it couldn't find a file with this name. So we want to always include quotation marks here, and let's give the correct name of the file. Now we have the two options that we mentioned: names to tell Stata that the first row of the file has the variable names, and clear to clear whatever data we have in memory. So let us run this command, and there we are. So we have 6 variables, 2,124 observations. We can click on Data Browser to have a look at data, make sure that it looks like what we had in Excel. So here you can see how Stata treats the variables differently. This variable is all numerical, so Stata interprets the variable as numerical. Same for age. number of hours worked and wage per hour, but the variables gender and education are string variables. They're in red, they have letters, and Stata does not interpret them as being numerical. So this worked. Now we can do the same for a tab delimited file. So we'll go back, open our Excel file, save as a tab delimited format, so you can scroll down until you find tab delimited text. So tab delimited simply means that the columns or each value is separated by a tab, okay, which is just a spacing character here. Before, we saved it in a format in which each value was separated by a comma. So Stata knew how to separate each value and each column by looking at the commas. This may be problematic if inside a variable, for example, you have a comma, and that may bring you problems. But here is not the case. So we'll save. Again, save that active sheet. Continue. Some save. So again, here we have the comma separated value file, and here we have the tab delimited. So this space here between the values is a tab. So we'll go back into Stata, and now we can bring the tab delimited file with the insheet command. Here we're simply telling Stata that the separation character is a tab, and it works. Again, we have imported the same variables and we have the same number of observations as we had before. Now if we don't want to, if we actually have the file in Excel, and in this case we did have the file in Excel, but we wanted to illustrate the cases in which we have CSV and TXT files. If we have a file in Excel, we can just import it directly using the import command. We can go up here and look at the help file, and we can look at the basic syntax for this command, and it simply is import Excel, and then we introduce the name of the file, and we give a couple of options. First option is to clear whatever data is in memory. Second option is to tell Stata that the first row records the variable names the same as we had here with the names option. So if we run this command, we again import the same file, but notice the difference that when we had the TXT or the CSV files, we had no variable labels. So we had the variable names but not the labels, so we did not know what, if I wouldn't tell you, you did not know what JBHRS meant. When you import directly from Excel, you have a label attached to it, which here is not informative because it's simply the variable name. But we can change that with the following command: label variable JBHRS, and between quotation marks wage per hour, and we can write whatever we want up to a certain restriction. So here I've already labeled this variable, and I can do the same, and I can do copy paste and simply change the variable name. So rate, I could do age and party ID, and I can simply replace this with actually here was number of hours worked, and this is the wage per hour in pounds. This is the age of respondent, and this is the ID of respondent. I can now run all these 3 lines at once and see my variables labeled here. Okay, so finally let's save this data set into a data format, a Stata format, a DTA format, so that we don't have to again import the file in the future, and so that we can keep the variable labels. So the changes that we've made to the dataset, we can keep them. So that is done using the save command with the name of the file that we want to give, again between quotation marks, and we add the option replace in case we had already the file stored in our folder. Now this variable is a little bit this option is a little bit dangerous because it overwrites essentially a file that is already saved, and this may be problematic if you are overwriting over a file that you actually want to keep. If you have an original file that you may delete things from, it may not be a good idea to replace the file, but rather to create a new file with a different name. But in this case, we can just do save bhps small replace, and we have a note saying that the file was not found because we still didn't have it in the folder. If we actually save it again, run the command again, we won't get the note because the file was actually already in the folder. Now we can just write clear. We clear whatever we have in memory, and if we want to use this file, we don't have to use Stata's drop-down menu. We can simply type in the command use, which opens Stata files, and we will type bhps small eta, and we open the file directly. Now this worked because this file was stored in the folder that we told Stata when we set up the working directory. If this file was in a different folder, we would have to give the path to the file, so we would have to copy this in and paste it behind the name of the file so that Stata would know where to get the file from. Here Stata simply looks into the folder that we've created as the working directory, looks for the file, and tries to open it. So this is the basic syntax on how to bring files into Stata, how to work with the main menu here. So the 2 main windows that we're going to work with are going to be important for us are the output window and the variables window. All the other windows are not that important because we are simply working with do file that stores all the information that we're entering into Stata. So we save this do file so that we can open it whenever we need and run the analysis again.